captive, reeking of whiskey, dust, and dried blood, the trading post where Elu stood was about to change everything, though the stranger who would do it hadn't opened the door yet. She had already counted the 4 men lounging near the stove who would not meet her eyes, and she had already measured the distance to the nearest horse twice, out of old habit more than hope, because a horsewoman never stops measuring distances even when her wrists are held by nothing but a debt someone else invented for her. The man holding her wrist went by Rukin, and he ran his post like a small kingdom built entirely out of other people's desperation. Today hers was the coin he meant to spend. She did not struggle against his grip. She had learned 3 days ago that struggling only entertained the men who watched, and Elu had never in her life given anyone entertainment for free. So she stood with her spine straight and her chin level in a doeskin dress gone gray with trail dust, and she watched the door the way she watched a canyon mouth before riding into it, waiting to see what kind of weather was about to walk through. What walked through an hour past noon, with the light behind him white and merciless, was a man leading 2 pack mules and wearing the kind of quiet that made clear at once he was not looking for trouble. He had sun-withered skin over a face still young beneath it, maybe 30, maybe younger, with the build of someone who worked cattle and fences with his own 2 hands rather than paying others to do it. He stopped just inside the doorway. He looked at Rukin's grip on her wrist, the way a man looks at a rattlesnake, coiled somewhere it has no business being, and something in his jaw went very still. Nobody in that room, least of all Elu, understood yet that his name was Emmett Cale, that he had ridden 3 days to trade for breeding stock and nothing else, and that within the next 10 minutes he was going to refuse the easiest, cheapest transaction, hand her a kind of freedom that no bill of goods could ever have carried. She only knew that a stranger had walked in, that the room's temperature had shifted, and that for the first time in 3 days Rukin's hand on her wrist had gone from careless to careful. 3 weeks before that, Elu's whole world had still had a shape to it, smoke rising from cook fires in a canyon. Her grandmother's grandmother had wintered in, the particular music of the wind moving through cottonwoods along a creek that never ran dry even in the worst years. Her uncle's voice calling instructions across a corral where she broke horses other men had given up on entirely. She had grown up the daughter of a man who read weather in cloud shadows, and a mother who could gentle a wild mustang with nothing but patience and a low voice, and Elu had inherited both gifts and sharpened them until half the band brought her their hardest horses rather than trust them to anyone else. She was proud of that. She had a right to be. It was the one thing in a shrinking world that nobody, not the soldiers pushing the boundary lines in tighter every season, not the traders who cheated her people at every crossing, not the endless grinding arithmetic of survival, could take from her, because it lived in her hands and nowhere else. Her grandmother had been the one to first put her on a horse's back before she could properly walk, and her uncle had been the one to teach her the deeper craft of it years later. Not force, never force, but patience stacked on patience, until an animal chose trust the way it might choose a herdmate. He used to tell her that a horse, gentled by fear, stayed afraid its whole life, no matter how well it behaved afterward, and that the only gentling worth doing was the kind an animal walked into on its own legs. She carried that teaching the way other people carried Scripture, applying it to horses first, and, though she did not yet know it, eventually to herself. Among her people she had a small reputation already. Young as she was, girls did not often break the hardest horses in camp, but Elu had never much cared what girls did or didn't often do, only what she herself was capable of, and she had spent years proving to anyone who doubted her that capability. She remembered, too, the particular sound of her mother singing while she worked hides by the fire, low songs in a language that made the whole camp feel wrapped in something warm even on the coldest nights, and she remembered her father's laugh, rare and sudden and always worth the wait. That a life built on land and family and skill like that was not something owed to her by anyone. It was something her people had built themselves, generation over generation, out of exactly the kind of stubborn, patient work she put into every green colt that came through the corral. That understanding would matter more than she knew later, when a man gave her wages instead of ownership, and she recognized instantly the shape of an honest trade, because her whole childhood had taught her what one looked like. Then the soldiers came through the canyon at dawn, following orders about a raid that had happened 2 valleys over and had nothing to do with her family, and in the chaos of gunfire and scattering horses and smoke thick enough to blind a person, Elu's band broke apart the way a river breaks apart around a boulder. Some paw, fleeing north into country she did not know, some south toward relatives near the border, her own parents vanishing into smoke, calling her name in a direction she could not follow, because a soldier's horse had already cut her off from it. She rode 3 days alone after that, living on nothing, following creek beds by instinct, telling herself the whole time that somewhere ahead she would find her people again, that a horsewoman with a good eye and a fast mare did not simply disappear off the face of the territory. She had not counted on the mare going lame in a rocky wash 40 miles from anywhere, or on the 2 days of walking that followed, or on arriving at Rukin's trading post with nothing left to trade but the only thing she had, the skill in her own 2 hands, and finding a man there who did not deal in honest trades at all. Rukin had looked her over the way he looked over a horse he intended to sell twice, once honestly and once dishonestly. He had given her water and a meal and a place to sleep in the back room, and by the time she understood what price he intended to attach to that kindness, 3 days had passed, and he had already begun telling the other men at the post that she owed him a debt for room and board that she had never agreed to. Not with soldiers 100 miles off in any direction, and not a soul in that room to stand for her. He liked to call it a debt because a debt sounded almost reasonable, almost like something a fair man might collect. What he meant underneath the word was ownership, plain and ugly, and Elu understood exactly what he meant, even if he never named it outright, because men like Rukin rarely say the true thing outright. They let the silence around the word do the saying for them. She had spent those 3 days doing what she had always done, under pressure, watching, learning, waiting for the shape of an opening. She watched which men in the room carried real authority, and which only borrowed Rukin's, watched the horses tied outside, and which of them were spooked and underfed, and which were cared for, watched the single door and the 2 windows and the low roof beam she could reach if she ever needed to. She was not a woman waiting to be rescued. She was a woman waiting for her moment, the way she had waited out 1,000 green colts who eventually, always, stopped fighting the rope and started listening to her instead. She simply had not expected her moment to walk in wearing trail dust and a rancher's plain wool coat, leading 2 pack mules, asking after breeding stock in a voice too quiet for the room it had entered. Those 3 days had not been gentle ones, even setting aside the invented debt hanging over her. Rukin's post drew a certain kind of traveler, and more than one of them had made remarks about her in front of her, in the particular careless way men make remarks about something they've already decided isn't quite a person in the room with them. She had learned to let those remarks slide off her the way rain slides off oiled leather, filing each man's face away without letting her expression move, because giving them her anger would only have confirmed whatever ugly story they already believed about her. At night, alone in the back room, Rukin dressed up as generosity. She allowed herself exactly as much fear as she needed to stay sharp and not one measure more, and she spent the dark hours running through everything she still had, her hands, her eyes, her knowledge of horses and distance and weather, cataloging her own resources the way her uncle had taught her to catalog herds, because a person who knows precisely what she has left rarely mistakes herself for someone with nothing. Emmett had not planned on any of this either. He had ridden out from his ranch 3 days earlier with a short list and a shorter patience for town business, 2 mares he'd heard Rukin was willing to part with, feed prices to check, a letter to post if the territory's mail ever bothered running on schedule. He was a man who preferred fence lines to crowded rooms, cattle to conversation, and the particular silence of his own land to almost anywhere else on earth. And he had built that preference the hard way, out of a life that had given him more losses than most men absorb by 30. He did not walk into Rukin's post looking for a cause. He walked in for mares. What stopped him cold, the instant he crossed the threshold, was the sight of a young woman standing rigid in the center of the room with a trader's hand locked around her wrist like a manacle, her chin up, her eyes flat and unreadable in the particular way of someone who has decided showing fear would only feed the men watching her. Emmett had grown up around horses long enough to read fear and defiance apart in an animal stance from 30 feet, and he read the same thing now in a person, and something in him, something that had been quiet and careful and closed off for 3 long years, simply would not let him keep walking toward the counter. He set his mule lead against the rail outside without looking away from her. Then he crossed the room, slow and unhurried, the way he crossed a pasture toward a horse he didn't want to spook, and he put his own body between Rukin and the woman with the trader's hand still on her wrist, close enough that Rukin had to either let go or explain to a stranger's face exactly why he wasn't going to. Rukin did not let go right away. He looked Emmett over, the way he looked over everyone who walked through his door, assessing what could be extracted from the encounter, and he found his voice first, sliding easy and confident into the silence Emmett had left open. "Territory business friend," Rukin said, mild as spoiled milk. "This one owes a debt. Nothing that concerns a man here for horses." "It concerns me now," Emmett said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. There was a stillness in it that carried farther than shouting would have. The stillness of a man who has already decided something and isn't interested in negotiating the decision, only the terms of it. Let go of her wrist. The room went quiet enough that Elu could hear the stove ticking as it cooled. Rukin's grin thinned, but did not disappear. Men like him rarely lose their grin, only sharpen it. He let go of her wrist, slow, deliberate, a performance of generosity that fooled no one, and then he spread his hands as if he were the reasonable one in the room and Emmett the trespasser. "Then pay for her," Rukin said. "Settle what's owed, and she's yours to walk out with. Simple as that." Something in Emmett's face went cold in a way Elu had not seen on any man's face before. Not anger exactly, something older and steadier than anger. "I don't buy people," he said, "not for any price, and not today." He turned then and for the first time looked directly at Elu rather than at Rukin, and his voice gentled the way it might for a spooked animal that had every reason in the world not to trust a stranger's hands. "But I've got a ranch 2 days south, that's sure to hand, who can gentle horses better than anyone I've ever paid wages to. If that's work you'd choose, your choice, nobody else's, I'll pay you the same as I'd pay any man for it. You walk out that door because you decided to, not because anybody bought you out of it." Elu did not answer right away. She had learned, in 3 days at that post and in a lifetime before it, not to trust the first kind offer a stranger made in front of an audience, because kindness performed for a room was rarely the same as kindness meant. She studied him instead, the plain wool coat, the calluses on the hand not resting near his belt, the way his eyes had not once dropped from her face to the rest of her, the way every other man in that room's eyes had. And she made her own calculation, cold and clear-headed. The same kind of calculation she made before ever swinging a leg over an unbroken horse, risk against reward, stranger against certainty. And the certainty in that room, if she stayed, had no future in it worth having. "Wages," she said. Her voice was steady, and it was the first time she had spoken since the soldiers scattered her family into smoke 3 weeks before. "For breaking horses, nothing more owed on either side." "Nothing more owed," Emmett agreed, "on either side." Rukin's grin curdled into something meaner, and he opened his mouth to argue the debt again, to invent some new figure to attach to her. But Emmett was already reaching into his coat and setting $2 silver on the counter, not for her, flatly, before Rukin could reach for them, but for the meal she'd eaten under this roof, paid honest. so that no man in this territory could later claim she left owing anything at all. It was a small gesture and a deliberate one, the kind of thing a careful man does to close a door permanently rather than leave it cracked for someone to kick open again later. Rukin took the coins with a scowl that promised, though neither of them could yet hear the promise in it, that this would not be the last either of them saw of him. Elu walked out of that trading post under her own power, on her own 2 feet, having chosen the direction herself, and it was the first choice she had been allowed to make freely since the morning the soldiers rode through her canyon. She did not thank Emmett out loud. She simply walked to where his mule stood tied, checked the near one's hooves with a practiced hand out of pure instinct, and looked back at him once, measuring him again the way she had measured him inside, not as a rescuer because she had rescued herself the moment she chose to speak the word wages instead of silence, but as a man whose offer she intended to hold to its exact terms, no more and no less. 2 days south, Emmett said, swinging up onto his own horse. You set the pace you're comfortable with. I don't run animals into the ground, and I don't run people into it either. It was, Elu thought as she mounted the spare mare he'd saddled without a word of instruction, the first sentence in 3 weeks that had made her believe, even a little, that she might be riding towards something other than another version of the same trap. The ride south took them through country that reminded her, in aching pieces, of the canyon she'd lost, mesquite flats giving way to rock, a river that ran shallow and clear in August, mountains standing blue and distant against a white sky. She rode a length behind Emmett most of the first day, watching him the way she watched everything new, cataloging his habits, how he checked his mule's loads without being asked, how he read the ground for water before he read it for danger, how he never once glanced back to see if she was following. As if he had already decided that whether she stayed was entirely her business and none of his to police. By the second afternoon she had drawn even with him, not from any warming toward him yet, only because riding a length behind someone all day felt too much like the position Rukin's men had put her in, and she was done for now, and maybe forever, riding behind anyone who hadn't earned it. They talked little that first day. Both of them practiced at silence for their own separate reasons. But what conversation they did have surprised her with its plainness. He raised nothing about the trading post, nothing about how she'd come to be stranded there, respecting some unspoken line she hadn't drawn, but appreciated all the same. Instead, he wanted to know about horses, what she looked for first in a green colt, whether she trusted a horse's eyes or its ears more when reading temperament, how long she generally gave an animal before deciding it could be gentled at all. She found herself answering at length more than she'd spoken in weeks, because it was the one subject in the world she could discuss without any of it touching the raw places, and somewhere in the exchange she noticed he was not simply making conversation to fill the miles. He was actually listening, weighing her answers, the way a serious rancher weighs any real expertise. And that, more than any polite kindness he might have shown instead, was what first loosened something guarded in her chest. They camped that first night at a spring he knew of off the main trail, and he built the fire on the side of the clearing that put the wind and the smoke away from where she'd laid her bedroll, a small consideration he made without comment and without appearing to expect any thanks for it. She noticed that, too. She noticed, in fact, nearly everything about him in those 2 days. Cataloging him the way she cataloged a new horse, because that was simply how her mind worked, and by the time his ranch came into view on the second evening, she had already decided privately that whatever else came of this arrangement, 30 was, at minimum, a man who kept his word in the small, unwatched moments as carefully as he kept it in the loud ones. That was rarer in her experience than any of the loud kindnesses men perform for an audience, and it counted for more. His ranch, when they reached it near dusk on the second day, was smaller than she expected, and better kept than she expected in equal measure, a modest house, a barn in good repair, corrals holding a dozen or so horses that shifted and watched the newcomers with a particular wariness of animals used to only one handler. 2 other hands worked the place, an older man named Griggs, who had ridden for Emmett's father before him, and a younger one, Dell, who could not keep the surprise off his face at the sight of an Apache woman riding in beside their boss with a bedroll and nothing else to her name. Emmett introduced her plainly, without embellishment and without apology. "This is Elu. She's hired on to work the horses, treat her wage same as any hands," and something in the flat certainty of how plainly he meant it discouraged either man from arguing, though Elu could see the question sitting behind Dell's eyes for days afterward. She was given the small room off the tack shed to sleep in, private and hers alone, and the first night she lay awake a long while listening to horses shifting in the corral and the particular silence of a place that was not her canyon and never would be, and she let herself grieve, quietly, for exactly as long as grief demanded and not 1 minute longer, because that was how she had always survived loss, by giving it its due and then standing back up. By morning she was in the corral before anyone else woke, studying the horses Emmett had mentioned in passing the day before. The two he'd all but given up on breaking, a rangy black gelding with a scar over one eye and a buckskin mare so herd-sour she'd put Dell in the dirt twice that spring. Emmett found her there at first light, standing at the rail with her arms loose at her sides, doing nothing that looked like work at all, simply watching the black gelding circle the corral with his ears pinned. He did not interrupt her. He leaned on the rail a respectful distance off and watched, too, and it was in that silence, more than in any conversation they'd had on the ride south, that something between them first shifted from stranger toward something else. Two people who both understood that watching, patient and unhurried. "Rookin's mares I never did buy," Emmett said eventually, not quite looking at her. "Figured the whole ride was wasted." "It wasn't," Elu said, and something almost like humor moved behind her flat expression there and gone. "You got a horse hand, instead better trade." It took her 3 days to get a hand on the black gelding, and she did it without a rope, in the traditional sense, without force, without the kind of breaking Griggs and Dell had both tried and failed at. She simply spent hours at the rail each day, low and still, letting the animal circle and snort and test her presence until his own curiosity outlasted his fear, until one morning he crossed the corral on his own and put his nose against her shoulder, and Emmett, watching from the barn door with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, understood in that single unremarkable moment that he had not hired a hand. He had witnessed a gift rare and real, the kind that came along maybe once in a rancher's whole working life. Word of it moved through the small ranching community, the way word always does in thin country, not fast but thorough, and within a month, neighboring outfits were riding out to Emmett's land with their own difficult horses, paying Elu directly in coin she kept in a tin box under her bed and counted with something like disbelief each time, because it was the first money in her life that had ever belonged to her outright, earned by her own hands and owed to no one. Griggs, gruff and slow to trust anyone, came around first, impressed, despite himself, by results he couldn't argue with. Dell took longer, prideful about the 2 times she'd succeeded where he'd failed, but even he softened by late summer, teasing her about it in the easy way men tease someone they've decided to respect. Dell's softening had not come easily, and it was worth remembering that it hadn't, because not every hard thing in Elu's new life resolved itself as cleanly as the black gelding had. For the first several weeks he kept a careful, needling distance, making small comments about hiring an Apache woman that he thought passed for jokes, testing to see how much of it she'd absorb without pushing back. She never gave him the reaction he seemed to be fishing for. She simply outworked him, quietly and completely, morning after morning, until the horses themselves argued her case better than any words could have. The buckskin mare that had thrown him twice, standing calm and cooperative under her hand within a week, a string of yearlings gentled in half the time he'd have needed for the same job. It was Emmett who finally put a flat stop to the comments one afternoon, not with a lecture, only a level word or two in front of the whole crew that made clear exactly whose judgment on this ranch was not up for argument, and after that Dell's remarks dried up entirely, replaced eventually, grudgingly, by something like real respect. Elu never sought that intervention and never thanked him for it either, but she noticed it, filed it away the same as everything else, one more small proof stacked onto a growing pile of them. Emmett softened slowest of all, and differently, not toward casual ease, but toward something quieter and more careful, the way a man moves around a wound he's not ready to name yet. Elu noticed it without understanding it fully at first, how he found reasons to be at the corral rail during her mornings with the horses, how he'd started, without either of them remarking on it, eating supper on the porch steps beside her, rather than alone at his table inside, how his silences around her had a different texture than his silences around Griggs and Dell, less closed, more like a door left open, rather than a door that simply hadn't been shut. She learned his history in pieces, the way he learned hers, both of them cautious traders of pain, offering only as much as felt survivable at a time. He had buried a wife 3 years back, a fever that took her in 4 days and left him alone on land they'd built together from nothing, and he had spent those 3 years since telling himself the solitude suited him, that he preferred the ranch's silence to the risk of caring about anyone again. Elu understood that particular arithmetic better than he knew. She had done the same math herself more than once. Standing at the edge of a scattered camp counting who was gone, you loved her. It was not a question, spoken once, on an evening when the horses were settled and the light had gone long and gold across the yard. I did. He turned the cup in his hands. Still do in the way. You keep loving somebody who isn't there to argue about it with you. Didn't figure I'd want to feel anything close to that again. Wasn't looking for it. Neither was I. It was the truest thing between them yet, and they let it sit there without either one reaching to explain it further, because some truths need room to breathe before anyone tries to build a sentence around them. There were harder evenings, too, in those middle months, evenings when the grief that had scattered her family caught up with her all at once, and she wanted nothing to do with anyone's company, not even his. Emmett learned, without ever hearing it outright, to read the difference between the silence she wanted filled and the silence she needed left alone, and he never once pushed past a closed door she hadn't opened for him herself. On one particularly bad night, the anniversary of the raid arriving without warning and knocking the breath clean out of her, she walked out past the corrals into the dark and sat alone against a fence post for over an hour, and when he finally came looking, worried but careful, he did not sit beside her or offer comfort she hadn't asked for. He simply set a blanket within her reach and went back inside, leaving the choice of whether to use it and whether to want company at all entirely hers. She used the blanket. She did not call him back out. And in the morning, when she finally came in for coffee, he raised nothing about the night before, only poured her a cup and let her decide, again, what parts of herself she was ready to hand him and what parts she wasn't yet. It was that same pattern, echoed in 100 small variations across the months, that taught her more surely than any declaration could have that this was a man who understood the difference between wanting someone and owning them, a distinction Rukin had never once grasped and Emmett seemed to carry in his bones. By midsummer, the two of them had fallen into a rhythm that neither one announced, but both of them recognized for what it was. She taught him, in slow, unhurried lessons at the corral rail, some of what her uncle had taught her. How to read a horse's ears before its feet, how patience beat force in nearly every argument an animal could raise. He taught her, in turn, the particular geography of his land, the names he'd given certain trees and bends in the river, small personal history given the way a man offers pieces of himself when he's decided, finally, that someone is safe to receive them. Neither of them named it courting. Both of them understood, without discussing it, exactly what it was. The turning came as it often does on an ordinary night that stopped being ordinary halfway through. A late summer storm rolled down off the mountains, fast and mean, lightning cracking close enough to rattle the barn's tin roof, and the horses panicked in a way Elu had rarely seen. the black gelding rearing hard enough to split a rail and bolt into the dark toward the river. Emmett went after him without a second's hesitation, on foot, no time to saddle anything, and Elu was 3 strides behind him before she'd even decided to follow, because that was simply what she did. She did not weigh a decision like that. She made it with her body before her mind caught up. They found the gelding half a mile off, tangled in brush at the river's edge, one leg cut and bleeding, panicked, past reason, striking out at anything that came near. It was Elu who talked him down in the driving rain, her voice low and steady under the thunder, her hand slow and sure even as the animal's hooves came within inches of her ribs. More than once, and it was Emmett who held the lantern steady and passed her what she needed without a word wasted. In a way, he had trusted almost no one since his wife died. By the time they got the gelding calm enough to lead home, soaked through and shaking with cold and adrenaline both, something had passed between them that neither one tried to name out loud that night. It didn't need naming. It had already happened. It was Griggs, of all people, gruff old Griggs who'd been slowest to warm to her, who put it plainest a few days later, watching the two of them work a young filly together, in easy, wordless coordination. Man doesn't look at a hired hand the way he looks at her. Griggs let it slip to Dell loud enough that Elu, mending tack nearby, heard every word and gave no sign of it, only smiled down at the leather in her lap where no one could see it. If Elu's story is the kind that stays with you, become a channel member. Tap the join button beside the channel name to help these stories keep coming. By the time the leaves along the river began turning that autumn, Elu and Emmett had built something neither of them announced, but both of them understood. Evenings on the porch that stretched longer than they needed to. A closeness in the way they moved around each other at chores that Griggs and Dell had stopped commenting on, because it no longer needed comment, a trust between them that had been earned in small daily increments rather than settled all at once. She had not forgotten her people. She thought of them daily, wondered which direction the smoke had carried her parents, kept half an ear on every trader's rumor that passed through the territory for word of a scattered Chiricahua band, regrouping somewhere north or south. But the ranch had become, without her quite deciding it, somewhere she wanted to be found, rather than somewhere she was merely waiting to leave. Rukin had not forgotten either of them. A man who traded in other people's desperation for a living did not easily let go of a transaction he considered stolen from him, and in the months since Elu walked out of his post on her own 2 feet, he had nursed the insult the way some men nurse a grudge until it curdles into something more dangerous than pride. He had spent that time gathering 3 hired guns, the kind of men who work for coin and raise no questions about the coin's justification, and inventing a story to give his return some flimsy cover of legitimacy, a manufactured claim that Emmett owed him for the mares he'd never actually bought. Inflated now with interest and insult until the figure was large enough to sound like a debt worth riding 2 days to collect, backed by men with rifles instead of ledgers. He rode onto Emmett's land on a cool morning in early October, 4 horses coming up the long approach at a pace too unhurried to be anything but a threat performed slowly, on purpose. Emmett saw them coming from the barn and knew before Rukin opened his mouth exactly what this was. Not a debt collection. Never that, but a man who had lost something he believed belonged to him and had come back to take a different kind of payment instead. The months since the trading post had not been idle ones for Rukin. He had recounted the story of that day so many times, in so many rooms full of men willing to nod along with whatever version flattered him, that he had half convinced himself of his own invented grievance. A rancher had walked off with property rightfully his, and no territory worth respecting would let a slight like that stand unanswered. He had recruited his 3 hired guns from a saloon 2 towns over, men with nothing much to lose and no particular loyalty beyond the coin in their pockets, and he had spent the ride south, rehearsing the speech he meant to give, the reasonable-sounding words he'd wrap around an unreasonable demand. The same trick he'd used on Elu herself 3 days running before Emmett ever walked through his door. You owe for stock, you walked off without paying. Rukin reined up at a distance that was almost, but not quite, out of easy rifle range. Figure of fair settlement's overdue. Man doesn't pay. Man loses something worth more than the mare's. There was no sale. Emmett walked out from the barn slow and steady, Griggs already moving for the house behind him without needing a word, Dell fading toward the corral where the rifles were kept. Never has been. You know that better than anyone standing here. Rukin's smile was thin and ugly in the morning light. Don't much matter what's true. Matters what I say happened, out here where there's no judge for 200 miles to argue otherwise. His eyes slid past Emmett toward the corral, toward Alu, who had stopped what she was doing and stood watching with the same flat, assessing stillness she'd worn the day he first laid a hand on her wrist. Brought some friends this time. Figured maybe I'd collect what I should have collected the first time round and call the mares even. It was not a subtle threat, and Alu did not treat it as one. She had spent her whole life reading exactly this kind of man, and she knew with total certainty that reasoning would not move him, that the only language men like Rukin respected was consequence, delivered plainly and without hesitation. She was already moving toward the tack shed before Rukin finished his sentence, and by the time his hired men began fanning out along the fence line, she had a rifle in her hands and a coil of rope over her shoulder, because horses, she had learned a long time ago, were weapons too, in the right hands. The fight that followed lasted only a handful of violent minutes, but every one of them mattered. One of Rukin's men made the mistake of riding too close to the corral, where the black gelding still carried a healthy distrust of strangers after the storm, and Alu, moving with the same calm precision she used to gentle any spooked animal, sent the whole string of penned horses surging through the gap she'd already left open. Wall of panicked hooves that scattered two riders and their nerve in the same instant. Emmett dropped a second man's rifle with a single well-placed shot before the man had fully cleared leather, a warning shot exactly like the one he'd never had to fire that first day at the trading post, proof enough that he could have hit flesh and chose not to this time. Rukin himself made straight for Emmett, pistol drawn, shouting something about debts and territory and the arrogance of a man who thought he could take what belonged to someone else, and it was Alu who put herself in his path with the same rope she'd been coiling a moment before, throwing it with the precision of a woman who had roped 1,000 panicked horses in her lifetime, catching Rukin's gun arm and yanking hard enough to put him face down in the dirt before he'd finished the sentence. Emmett was on him in the next breath, pistol pressed flat and certain against the back of Rukin's neck, and the fight, such as it was, ended there in the dust of a yard Alu had come to think of somewhere in the last few months without quite noticing the shift, as partly her own. Ride out, Emmett's voice was low and final, hauling Rukin up by the collar. Ride out now, and don't come back onto this land again. Next time there won't be a warning shot in it anywhere. Rukin rode out with what remained of his nerve and none of his dignity, his 3 hired men trailing behind him, with the particular sullen defeat of men who'd been paid for a job they no longer believed they could finish. He did not come back that autumn, or the one after. Some debts, it turned out, really could be settled, just never the way he'd tried to collect them. Griggs, limping slightly from where a horse had clipped him during the scatter, but otherwise unhurt, spent a good while afterward shaking his head over the whole business, muttering that he'd worked this land 20 years, and never once seen a fight settled so fast by a rope and a well-timed gate latch. Dell, for his part, had put himself squarely between the ranch house and the second gunman with nothing but a pitchfork and more nerve than sense, and though he'd come out of it with nothing worse than a torn sleeve, the story of it grew a little in the telling every time he retold it over the following winter. Who had been in the thick of the real thing found herself smiling at how thoroughly he'd cast himself as the hero of a fight she and Emmett both knew he'd mostly watched from behind a fence post. She let him have the story. Some kindnesses cost nothing and mean everything to the person receiving them. Alu was still catching her breath, rope coiled loose in her hand, when Emmett crossed the yard to her, and for a moment neither of them made a sound, because there was nothing that needed saying beyond what their eyes already carried, a recognition, plain and unhurried, that whatever this was between them had just proven itself in the one arena that mattered most out here, the arena of who a person actually is when everything is at stake. You didn't have to do that. A pause, quieter. The rope. Could have let me handle him. I chose to. Something almost fierce moved through her voice, a woman drawing a line under a lifetime of other people making choices on her behalf. Same as I chose to walk out of that trading post. Same as I chose to stay here after. I don't do anything anymore I haven't chosen, Emmett. Not one thing. He looked at her a long moment in the settling dust, and something in his face, careful, guarded, closed for 3 long years, opened the rest of the way at last. Then, I hope. His voice caught just slightly. You'll choose to stay a while longer yet. It was 2 weeks after that, in the golden light of a mild November afternoon, that a small band of riders appeared on the ridge above the ranch, moving slow and cautious the way people move through unfamiliar country. And Elu, out at the corral with the black gelding, gentled now into something like an old friend, because something in the shapes of the horses and the riders' postures struck a chord she hadn't heard in months and had almost stopped hoping to hear again. They were survivors of her band, 11 of them, thin and travel-worn, but alive, led by her uncle, the same man who had taught her half of what she knew about horses in the corral of a canyon that no longer existed except in memory. They had spent months scattered and searching, piecing together rumors from traders and other bands, following a trail of half-true stories that had finally improbably led them to a ranch 2 days south of a trading post where a horsewoman with a particular gift had reportedly gone to work for wages. The reunion in that yard was not a quiet one. Elu crossed the distance at a dead run, and her uncle swung down from his horse to meet her, and there were tears that neither of them tried to hide, and questions tumbling over each other too fast to answer in order. Who else had survived? Where had they wintered? Was there word of her parents? There was word, some of it good and some of it not, the way news from a scattered people so often is grief and relief, arriving in the same breath the way they so often do in a life like hers. But there was, at the center of it, the unbearable simple fact that she was not alone in the world after all. That a piece of what she'd lost that morning in the smoke had found its way back to her. Her mother, she learned, had made it north to a cousin's camp near the border, alive and mending, and word had already gone ahead that Elu had been found as well, so that within the season, if the trader's rumors held true, mother and daughter might see each other again for the first time since the smoke tore them apart. Her father's fate was less certain, one uncle believing he'd fallen in the first hour of the chaos, another swearing he'd seen him riding hard toward the eastern hills days later, and Elu carried that uncertainty the way she carried everything hard, giving it exactly the grief it demanded and no more, holding a narrow, stubborn thread of hope for the rest. For 3 days her uncle and the others camped near the ranch, and Emmett, watching from a respectful distance, made sure they wanted for nothing. Grain for their horses, meat from his own stores, a quiet, unspoken understanding that this reunion was hers to navigate and his only to support, never to steer. On the 3rd evening, her uncle found her alone at the corral rail in a blue hour before full dark, and he raised the question everyone in that camp had been too polite to ask directly, whether she meant to ride with them when they moved on, to help rebuild what the soldiers had scattered, to come home to whatever home could still be assembled out of pieces. Elu did not answer quickly, because the question deserved more than a quick answer. She thought about the canyon she'd lost, about the family she still loved fiercely and would always love, about the debt of belonging she felt toward people who shared her blood and her history and had searched for months to find her. And she thought too about a corral 200 yards from where she stood, about a black gelding who trusted her completely, about coin in a tin box that she had earned with her own 2 hands and answered to no one for, about a man who had refused, on principle, to ever treat her as anything less than a person free, and had then spent every day since proving that refusal was not a performance, but the truest thing about him. To her uncle, plainly, she gave her answer. "I love you, and I will always be your family, wherever I ride. But this is where I choose to stay, not because anyone bought me a place here, because I earned one, and because the man who let me earn it is the one I want beside me when I do." Her uncle studied her a long moment, the way he'd studied 1,000 horses she'd broken over the years, and then he nodded, slow and understanding, because he had raised her to know her own mind, and could hardly object now that she'd used exactly the gift he'd given her. "Then we'll ride on light. And then, after a moment, and we'll ride back heavy, come spring, to see how you've settled." It was, in its way, a blessing, plainly given, the kind her people gave rarely and meant completely when they did. Before he rode out with the others the next morning, her uncle sought out Emmett alone, at the corral rail where so much of the last several months had unfolded, and talked to him plainly, man to man, the way he might have spoken to any suitor asking after a niece he loved. He did not ask for coin or cattle or any of the usual bartered promises. He wanted only to know whether Emmett understood what he was choosing, a woman who would never again be handled, negotiated over, or spoken for by anyone, himself included. Emmett made clear without hesitation that he understood completely, that he had understood it the very first day, standing in a trading post refusing to put a price on a person, and that nothing about the month since had changed his mind one particle. Her uncle studied him the same unhurried way he studied everything, and then he extended his hand, and the two men shook on an understanding that needed no further words to carry its weight. Word reached Elu's mother before the season turned, exactly as the traders had promised it would, and though a full reunion between mother and daughter would take another year of careful travel to arrange, the letters that passed between them that winter dictated to traders willing to carry them, translated back and forth, with more patience than skill. Dot carried enough love across the distance to steady something in Elu that had ached quietly since the morning of the raid. Her mother's first letter held little beyond simple relief and a mother's blunt approval of any man her daughter chose freely, but it was enough, more than enough, to close a wound Elu had carried in silence for the better part of a year. Emmett and Elu were married the following spring, in a ceremony that honored both the traditions she carried in her blood and the plain, unadorned vows common to the ranching country he called home, her uncle standing witness alongside Griggs and Dell, a fire built at dusk. Coin exchanging hands for nothing at all that day, because for the first time since the smoke scattered her world, nothing about Elu's life needed to be bought, sold, bartered, or owed. She had walked out of a trading post as a captive with a debt invented against her name, and she walked into her own wedding as a woman who had built, plank by plank and horse by horse, a life entirely her own choosing. If you've stayed with Elu and Emmett this long, tap the join button beside the channel name and become a channel member. It truly helps. The ranch grew, in the years that followed, into something larger than either of them could have built alone, a reputation up and down the territory for horses gentled better than anywhere else for 100 miles. A partnership between a rancher who had learned to open a door he'd spent years keeping shut, and a horsewoman whose people visited often enough that the corral fence some seasons held nearly as many Chiricahua horses as it did the ranch's own stock. Rukin's name faded into the kind of story passed along as a warning to newer traders about the cost of treating people as debts rather than as people, and eventually he sold his post and moved on to some other territory entirely, having learned the hard way that some things simply cannot be purchased no matter what price a man is willing to name. Griggs stayed on until his knees finally gave out on him for good, and even then he refused to leave entirely, settling into a small cabin at the edge of the property, where he could still hobble out most mornings to watch Elu work a green colt and grumble, with obvious affection, about how the operation had gotten soft since a woman started running half of it. Del married a rancher's daughter from the next valley over 2 years after the fight at the gate, and wondered aloud to Elu, with more humility than he'd shown in his first months on the place, whether she'd help gentle the pair of carriage horses he meant to give as a wedding gift, a request she granted without a word of teasing about how far he'd come. Though she thought about it plenty privately and smiled. Elu's mother made the full journey south the following autumn, exactly as promised, and stood at the ranch gate a long moment, taking in the corrals and the house and the daughter she hadn't seen since the smoke of that terrible morning, before crossing the yard at last to hold her the way she must have held her as a small child, fierce and unwilling to let go. She stayed the whole winter teaching Elu's own children, in the years that followed, the same songs she'd once sung over hides by a canyon fire that no longer existed anywhere but in memory. And the ranch, in that slow, steady way families accumulate themselves around a good piece of land, became something neither a trading post's cruelty nor a soldier's raid had managed to take from her, a home chosen freely, built by her own hands, and never, not for one single day of it, owed to anyone. Alu never forgot the exact words Rukin had used that first day, the word debt dressed up to sound reasonable when it meant something else entirely, and she never forgot either the exact words Emmett had used to answer him. "I don't buy people, not for any price, and not today," because those words had been the true beginning of everything that followed. More than the standoff, more than the wages, more even than the wedding vows a year later. They had been the moment someone finally treated her choice as something worth protecting rather than something worth owning, and everything good that came after had grown out of that single, quiet refusal. She kept the tin box of coin under the bed she now shared with Emmett for the rest of her life, not because she needed the money anymore, their household long past needing it, but because it reminded her, every time she opened it, of the exact shape of the freedom she had built with her own 2 hands, one gentled horse and one honest wage at a time. Proof, whenever she needed it, that a woman could walk into a trading post a captive and walk out, eventually, as something no man had ever given her and no man could ever take away. Entirely, permanently her own.